Hi. So, in the last lecture, we talked about how Judaism calls humans, each individually, to choose to remain close to God. In this lecture, we'll talk about two men who we are told in Genesis make that choice to remain close to God, thereby establishing the foundation for a people. And these two men are Noah and Abraham. Noah, whose story appears in Genesis 6 to 9, is a descendant of Seth, himself the third son of Adam and Eve. So he's following a direct lineage, and that'll be important for the narrative. What the story of Noah shows us is that for the human community, the gravest problem, our biggest concern, is distance from God, or the failure to live in harmony with God. And correspondingly, on the flip side, the greatest gift or the greatest good thing is to live a life in harmony with God, to follow God's call and command. Jewish law is known as halakha, meaning to go or to walk, and this is understood as um, to go or to walk in the ways of the Lord. Not just any way you want, not just like, oh, I'm going, I'm walking, I'm doing stuff, so I must be doing it. No, in the ways of the Lord. That's what counts as halakha. Now, the story of Noah comes at a time when, quote, the earth was filled with lawlessness. That's Genesis 6:11. So much so that, and this is a quote, the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. It's Genesis 6:6. But Noah himself was a righteous man, and he, quote, found favor with the Lord. So the Lord told Noah to build an ark upon which he and his family would be saved from the torrential flood that was to follow. Now, Noah answered to the call of the Lord, and one can imagine, much to the amusement of his lawless community, he built a great boat in his yard. And when he was, we are told, 600 years old, the flood came, and all flesh that stirred on earth perished. An interesting development in the afterlife of the Bible is that today the story of Noah is more popular in children's narrative than just about anywhere else. This strikes me as a little bit funny. Noah and the Ark, with its animals and pairs, appear in all manner of children's books, toys, bedroom decor. It's a story that's come to, for most, to symbolize the salvation of all land-based life. It's a cozy tale, and it's populated by a kind of cartoony menagerie, as here. That all flesh died that moved upon the earth is most often overlooked, but we cannot feel the import of this narrative or the cautionary tale that it tells without attending to the catastrophic loss of life that the flood brought with it. Michelangelo, a Christian artist of the Renaissance era, captures this destruction in a way that crib quilts and wooden toy boats just can't. The story of Noah is a story of Yahweh's wrath and power, and of humans' frailty and the total devastating effects of moral failure. But even in this story, often read allegorically, as though exists more as a thought experiment than as an experiential historical narrative, it's very hard for us to imagine all flesh dying that moves upon the earth. So it's often like, oh, this is a metaphor for something. But we can see how thoroughly, through this tale, we can see how thoroughly pragmatic and earthbound a community and a tradition that Judaism is. When the floodwaters recede and the ark's inhabitants regain their landed home, the Lord promises to Noah, never again will I doom the earth because of man, since the devisings of man's mind are evil from his youth. Nor will I destroy every living being as I have done. It's a kind promise. And here, for the first time, we see a theme that will return in future narratives, in future lectures, the theme of humanity's inherent imperfection. It's from our youth that our minds are evil, and there's nothing really we can do about it, so God decides it's sort of not right to judge us outright and wholesale for that. Judaism's heroes are not perfect people. As humans, we are every one of us flawed, faulty, and frail, and just such is the nature of embodied life. And further, we're alive in a material context through which God speaks to us, acknowledging our frailty, but nonetheless calling us into relationship. God's promise, as established in the story of Noah, is more than just a unidirectional assertion of intent. It's a covenant or reciprocal relationship. And a covenant is what I'm talking about here, and this is something that's going to come up a couple times today. It goes both ways. That's the nature of the covenant. It requires both awareness and response from the human community. God tells Noah that he set a rainbow in the sky as a sign of this covenant, promising, when I bring clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature among all flesh, so that the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. this is an image that Professor Steve Cunha took outside Founders Hall on the HSU campus, and you look closely, there's a double rainbow there. So it's a nice, this is the embodied tradition. It's a nice, you can see signs of God's relationship with humanity in the world that we're living in a really physicalized way. And regardless of your own moral or traditional commitments, I want to ask you this. Can you imagine a reciprocal relationship with whatever it is that you conceive to be divine? And how might you receive knowledge of the divine's role in that relationship? And how might you offer a meaningful response? Like, there are certain challenges that go into that kind of communication. It's not an easy question, but it's one that we have all likely faced in one way or another in our lives. Our God, our ideals, our better selves, however you like to conceive of those, however we conceive of divinity or holiness. It's a challenge to imagine a real active relationship with that, since most of us are not spoken to directly by a voice from on high, and most of us can't be sure that our voice is ever heard. We sort of become, a little concerned about that at times, like desolate and like we're left. I can sit here and I can speak to the heavens, but like, really, who's listening? I've got a dog running around. He's listening. The birds, maybe, but like, can I be sure that my prayers are heard? This is the challenge set by the God of the Hebrew Bible. Remaining close to God, answering to the call of God, walking in the way of the Lord. This is what Jews strive to do. And so it's a good question. How would you imagine that reciprocal relationship? Generally, this challenge is met, or not, by humans who do not enjoy direct conversations with their God. Although such direct conversations didn't, in the biblical narrative, make things altogether easier. Back in the day when people could walk, in the way of the Lord and have direct conversations with either God or the angels of God, their lives weren't necessarily like just all free sailing, easy. This is made clear in the second story that we'll look at in this lecture, the story of Abraham. Now, we've said that Judaism is one of the first, or is the first, Abrahamic faith, which means that it is the first of three major world religions that traces its roots to this figure of Abraham, a man who in Genesis 12 is old and childless, with no palpable hope for an heir or a son to take over what he's built, no hope for a familial legacy, and that was a big deal then. That's how you sort of moved on. I mean, it's still a big deal to a lot of people now, but he had no hope for it. But, and Abraham is a Semite, which means that he's a descendant of Shem, as you can see here. That's where that word comes from. Shem was himself a son of Noah, so we're still following that traditional legacy. And it was with Abraham that Yahweh indicates for the first time and clearly that this lineage itself defines the chosen group, the Lord's people. It's also with Abraham that we start to know these people as Hebrews, a name likely drawn from Eber, who was himself an ancestor of Abraham. So that's where we get Hebrews. Now, Abraham lived in the land of Ur in modern-day Iraq. And though he was old and childless, as I've said, he was for the most part comfortable. He had gotten used to his life, and he was ready to stay there for the rest of it. And it's at that point that Yahweh appears to him, and this is what's sort of shown here. From a Christian artist, by the way, these little cherubs and things, much of the Jewish art we're looking at is composed by Christian artists, and there's historical reasons for that. Jews throughout history haven't had this sort of comfort of settled, continuing existence in a singular place that allows for the creation of large-scale art. So much of Jewish art until the modern period has taken the form of usable goods. So a lot of these images are Christian. We could talk more about that, but so Yahweh appears to him and tells him that if he leaves his comfortable life and goes where he's told, then Yahweh will make him the father of a great nation, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars or as the sands of the desert, and that his family would be protected and preserved, and that they would be chosen. And so that's a big promise. On their part, because covenants with God, as we know, are reciprocal, remember, they go both ways, Abraham's descendants would themselves need to walk in the way of the Lord. They would be required to reject idolatry, which was practiced generally at their time, and to embrace monotheism, which was not generally practiced at their time. And the sign of the covenant would be circumcision. Thus said the Lord, shall my covenant be marked in your flesh as an everlasting pact. The kind of human share in it. Abraham, we're told, was 99 years old when he circumcised himself with likely a sharp rock, and all males in his tribe did the very same thing, the very same day. Now, I bring this up not to scandalize you or, this picture is kind of funny, but because it speaks to the total dedication, both spiritual and physical, required of those who would hitch their wagons to Yahweh. This is not a covenant to be entered into lightly. Now, one point to make is that when Sarah, Abraham's wife, was named Sarah, and their names were actually changed in the course of the text. It was Abram and Sarai, but I'm going to just keep it consistent. When Sarah became too old to bear a son, before the Lord spoke to her, she knew she was too old to bear a son. She gave her handmaid Hagar to her husband, and this was common practice at the time, um, so that he might have a son by her, so that he might have a son even though Sarah herself could not give him one. And he did so, and Hagar gave birth to Abraham's son Ishmael, um, who is dropped from the Hebrew Bible narrative really shortly thereafter, but will be picked up again by Muslims who see themselves as descendants of this first of Abraham's sons. So that'll come back. After Ishmael is born, Abraham is told by an angel of the Lord that Sarah will conceive and bear a son herself. Sarah overhears this and she laughs, which happens to end up being the root word of her son's name, Isaac. She knows her own age, she knows her own body, and she has some sense of the possible. But despite her disbelief, Sarah conceives, in her 90s and bears Isaac, who becomes a patriarch in the Jewish tradition. And here's another theme that we'll see repeat itself throughout is the reversal of primogeniture. Primogeniture is a fancy word that means firstborn. And at the time in the culture, it was the firstborn son who received everything, the inheritance, the blessing, the power, the glory, all of that. And so with Isaac and the story of Isaac and Ishmael, we see the ways in which God can reverse that he's not answerable, and his people, when they're directed, are not answerable to the ways of men, to the ways of humans, but that God himself has a separate agenda, a different one that can reverse what we think of as normal. Skipping over the firstborn son, that would have been scandalous at the time. But Ishmael and his mother Hagar are rejected. He is the oldest, but they are rejected. They're sent out into the desert to appease Sarah's jealousy. She's jealous of what Ishmael might mean for her son Isaac. And that's really the end of their part in the Hebrew Bible. But the point for Judaic narrative is that God can do the impossible. He can fill the womb of a barren old lady. He can reverse social traditions and social norms. But in return, Abraham must himself accept the impossible. And that's the image we're looking at here from another Christian artist, by the way, Caravaggio, whom I quite like. Against all human odds and all natural possibility, he's been given Isaac. And then God said to Abraham, in the words of Bob Dylan, God said to Abraham, "Kill me a son. And take Isaac up Mount Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice to me." Now, aside from the very human distress of killing one's own child for the sake of a god, right? If somebody did that today, they'd be imprisoned. But aside from that distress that must have caused for Abraham, there was also he was also faced with, in his mind, the end of the legacy that God had promised, right? He'd been promised to be the father of nations, and he'd already booted Ishmael, so whether or not he's going to come back is unlikely, and this is his heir. This is the one who's going to do it. Is he going to get another one? He's got to give up all hope for the future. He's got to just throw in all his chips with this promise that God has made him. He agrees, and by agreeing to do so, by proving his willingness, Abraham proved his ultimate trust in and submission to God, his worthiness to be the father of nations. And so an angel of the Lord intervenes, and that's the image here. And Abraham keeps his son. He's given back at this moment what was never really taken, and also what was never really his. Now, there's a story about this, a midrash. We're going to talk about midrash today. It's an I. One that appears not in the Bible itself, but in later rabbinic commentary. And it goes, "While Isaac lies on the rock and it looks up at his father with a knife in his hand, the angels in heaven weep. And their tears fall into Isaac's eyes, and he's blinded to save him from seeing the sight of his own father kill him, and he will become blind later in his own story. And at that moment, Abraham is granted sight, seeing that the angel of the Lord is there and knowing that he has a way out." So midrashic commentaries on the story of the Hebrew Bible abound. They're everywhere. Rabbis love these. They're interpretive tales that help to fill in the gaps in what is really a very sparse text. And while they're not part of the Tanakh itself, they are considered holy. In the larger sense of the word, they are considered Torah. As we've seen, Torah refers to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, most narrowly defined. It's those books we looked at in the list last time. But it is a word that means many things other than that has a whole spectrum of meaning. More broadly used, it applies to midrashic commentaries like the one we've just talked about, teachings of a rabbi, even conversations amongst those whose commitment is to walking in the ways of the Lord, to figuring out how to do that and really trying to do it well. So it's got a wide usage. So these are the lessons we can draw from Judaism today. To live a life of meaning, it's important that we try to maintain a relationship with whatever it is that we conceive of as divine. And to walk in the way of our own sense of divinity, we need to think about what is good and just, and really try to do that. So next time we'll continue our exploration of Judaism's foundational narratives through the lives of a couple especially flawed heroes, which might grant us all access into how best to do that. So until then.